Thank you for joining the End User Excellence Podcast. I'm your host, Donovan Linton, and today I have with me a very special guest, Mr. Healthcare CTO, Cloud Technology Architect, Mr. Ambassador. I'm trying to remember all the names he gave me.
Oh Lordy, I
Mr.
have a
Kurt
collection.
Telep.
How you doing,
How are you?
Donovan? Glad to be
I'm
here.
doing well today. Hope all
Yeah,
is well as with you.
everything's going good. Everything's going good. Busy as ever. It's amazing how when your hypervisor starts becoming really popular all of a sudden, some strange reason, it kind of
People want
ramps
to
up the
talk to
amount of
you.
work I'm doing.
That's always a good thing.
Exactly.
Speaking of, on that subject, you have some. You're going to talk to about a little bit. Talk to us a little bit about the community edition for the hypervisor. We knowing that Nutanix made some changes to their hypervisor earlier this year, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about how that has affected you guys and some of the changes you guys have seen on your side.
Yeah, I'd absolutely love to. Right, Community Edition is something that's a bit of a passion of mine here within Nutanix. For people that don't know specifically what Nutanix Community Edition is, Community Edition is the downloadable version of the Nutanix HyperConverged stack, right? So that includes the hypervisor, AHV, AOS, right? The HyperConverged platform, and then Prism and Prism management and all the other components that go along with building the entire HyperConverged infrastructure with Nutanix. Community Edition specifically is designed to run on hardware that may not necessarily be traditionally Nutanix qualified certified hardware, right? So it may be hardware that you have sitting in your Homelab. It may be hardware that you have in old data center hardware, things like that. But basically, it is a platform that allows users to get the Nutanix experience without necessarily having to make a Nutanix purchase.
So with Nutanix CE, who's really that target audience for Nutanix CE?
So the target audience for CE is really interesting, right? And that's something that even internally we've been discussing a lot about. So if we go back kind of a little bit of history, CE was released almost 9 years ago, right? The first version became available. Actually, it's when we were still referencing things as KVM instead of AHV. It became available around early 2015, right? Is when CE became announced. We announced it right around .next. To give, we were really looking for a platform to give, let's call them influencers, right? Consultants, bloggers, analysts, educational facilities and organizations, students that were in Nutanix classes, and then internally SEs that needed to do demos, right? Maybe even potential partners and channel organizations. They were really the original target audience for Community Edition. And it's funny because if I go back and I look at some of the original engineering notes around when Community Edition was first, came to being, there's a really great comment in there that talks about how CE at the time required a server with 4 cores and virtualization and 16 gig of RAM. Better to have 32 and an SSD, and that's not something that you'd find in the average desktop, laptop, or other commonly available hardware. As I look at my workstation, my personal workstation, which has 8 cores and 64 gig of RAM and a GPU and 2 SSDs in it, and I think I spent like $400 on eBay for it, right? So the original target audience was not necessarily the Homelab user, right? But around February 14th of this year, when ESXi free went away, our downloads for AHV and for Community Edition went through the roof, right? We had a whole new user base that had just been basically abandoned, and they needed somewhere to go, right? So they kind of jumped in, and the forums lit up like a Christmas tree with users having installation issues and people who had not read any of the documentation trying to do the install. CE originally was very, you plug in this USB drive, you boot it up, and it worked or it didn't. The hardware that it worked on was relatively small, very specific, and we had a bunch of users that all of a sudden were trying to install CE on systems we never expected them to, right? all NVMe systems with 32 core processors and all kinds of crazy RAID adapters and things like that that we either didn't have drivers for, we didn't expect somebody to be installing CE on a server that maybe cost them $20, $30, $40,000, right? So we did a lot of work after February 14th to get kind of the latest release, CE 2.1, out and to the field to fix a lot of those issues.
Healthcare CTO. Can you talk a little bit about what you do and how did you actually get so involved with Nutanix CE?
So I am a field CTO for healthcare here at Nutanix, right? And what that means is I spend a lot of my time having conversations about strategy, direction, overall implementation, and how do we leverage healthcare applications in the world of Nutanix? Where are we strong with it? What direction should we go? How do we have alliances and work with those healthcare application vendors? Obviously, Community Edition doesn't really fit into that very nice and cleanly, right? But one of the things I love about Nutanix is the fact that I do have the freedom to have some of these passion projects to work on, and CE happens to be one of them. When I first came to the organization, I was just an SE. I came here from Dell EMC, and obviously I knew of Nutanix. I had talked about Nutanix with my customers. But I wasn't aware of all the breadth of what we could do as an organization. And I'm a very hands-on worker, right? You can see my workshop behind me with 3D printers and laser cutters, and I repair old 8-bit machines. Yes, I am an engineer's engineer, and I like to learn by doing. I'm very hands-on. And I found CE and, grabbed some old R610s and an R510 and, tried to get CE to deploy, ran into issues, worked through them, and I learned so much about the platform getting CE up and running. And then that became the baseline for me to continue to educate myself about Nutanix, right? That's where I learned files and objects and Prism Central and all the other pieces that are a part of the platform. And then what tended to happen was, we have an internal Slack channel, there's the .next community. As I continue to work more through the platform and knew more about the platform, as people asked questions, I would answer them, and more people asked more questions, and I answered more questions, and then I found a bug, and I helped identify that bug and worked with engineering to fix that bug. And then that just snowballed into I've become pretty much the CE guy, right? That is, on the Nutanix forums, out on Reddit answering questions. It's really been a fun journey. It's been a challenging journey at times, but I'm really privileged that it's also helped me make the connections that I've made inside the company to help drive the direction of Community Edition too. And I still do a ton, besides my regular lab that runs my day-to-day, I do a ton of work from the Community Edition kind of engineering testing, right? I have everything from, traditional Nutanix nodes here in the lab here in the house. I have an HP cache register system behind me that I've got CE running on, Intel NUCs, like just a lot of testing work and helping to influence the direction of the platform.
That's awesome. And so, from having tested and used the CE, you can kind of see the evolution of the product. Especially with the later releases with 2.1 and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about that of how that product or how you've helped driven that product to where it is today?
So CE, if we go back to CE 1.0, right, which came out in 2015, CE pretty much was its own code base, right? So since, I want to say it was AOS 4.1 that the original CE was released on. And, it was, as new releases came out, it had to be separately compiled, built on its own, then released. And then the upgrade process was basically pull out your USB stick, put a new USB stick in, reconfigure your cluster, right? There was no real, you could do code upgrades, but it was outside of the LCM process. It was all very, very specific and driven to CE. And part of the challenge of something like that is when CE wasn't extremely popular, right? It's really hard to maintain the resources that you need to support something like that. So probably about a year and a half ago, it was really time to give CE a facelift. It was still based on old AOS 5.18 code by that point in time, old version of HV. And we needed to make a change. And in order to be successful with that, a decision was made by product management to realign Community Edition with the current release code base, right? So the commercial version, right? And we went through some growing pains with that, right? Because we had built all of these, let's call them special drivers for Homelab users and things like that into the old CE1.x code base. And now we're bringing 2.0, which we lost a lot of those drivers. They went away, right? And we learned a lot about how to manage this CE code base that now lives within the regular release code base for when changes occur and when things like security audits happen against code, or hey, we're removing a particular driver or functionality because we're not using that anywhere in the production release. Well, oh my gosh, we're going to now impact all of these Community Edition users that may be dependent on that, right? So CE 2.0, we went through some real interesting initial growing pains there. But what we got out of moving into that release code base was the ability to use things like LCM, right? You can use the same lifecycle management that you'd use for software on a release version on Community Edition. We gained the ability to get patches faster, to get security updates faster. Now, there are still limitations, right? We don't do any hardware LCM on the Community Edition side because honestly, I don't know what hardware you're running. When your platform could be anything from, an old, Coffee Lake Intel processor running on an Intel NUC all the way to, a G7 or G8 Supermicro equivalent, I can't manage all of that, and I can't provide firmware around those things. So that was the trade-off. But from a software perspective, we can do all the same LCM functions that we can do with release. Now, 2.0 was still the current version on February 14th, Valentine's Day. So 2.1, we came very quickly. And it was a massive effort internally with, the folks that we have in engineering that worked on it, folks from product management that helped us get it done. They took a ton of feedback from myself and the rest of the internal community at Nutanix, right? What drivers do we need? What's broken? What needs to be fixed? And, there are some silly things that you never would think about would break something that's an enterprise product. I'll give a great example. We had an issue where if you were using certain commercial grade SSD drives, the installation would fail. And nobody could really figure it out. We knew if you changed drives, it would work. And I really dug in on the problem one weekend, and I realized that the serial numbers on the drives were too long. We were truncating them. Now, with enterprise drives, that never became an issue because the enterprise drives never had a serial longer than 16 characters. But when I had two drives that had more than 24 characters and you cut off the end and they had the same serial number, that becomes a problem in release code. So, we had to patch around things like that. And the CE 2.1 release was really about helping to fix that installation experience so that folks could get onto the platform and start using and leveraging the platform quicker, right? So that's kind of where we've gone from an evolution. Now, there's still bugs. We're still working on things. I still answer a lot of forum questions like, hey, I'm trying to get the install done. But we're now more on the strange edge case scenarios are broken versus the, 3/4 of users trying to install are running into this issue and have to make a manual workaround.
So you kind of speak about it being a fork of the commercial product. What are the differences today for, say, CE and the commercial product?
So it's not a fork, right? It's the same code, right? Okay. The difference is in the installer, right? So when we deploy a cluster, we deploy release, we use a tool called Foundation to deploy the cluster, right? And Foundation really handles all of the imaging of the nodes, configuring the CVM, will build out the actual cluster, and it does a lot of that over out-of-band management, like IPMI or iDRAC or ILO, things like that. But with CE, we really don't have the capability to do that. You may install CE on something that has an IPMI or an iDRAC, but you also may not, right? We also can install CE nested in other hypervisors, right? So you can install CE inside ESXi or underneath Proxmox, things, or AHV itself if you wanted to. So we leverage what's called Phoenix for the installation. And Phoenix is part of the under the covers Foundation process, but it lets us present a GUI to the user to make the necessary selections to do the install. So it's really setting a lot of flags on the release so that the release is aware that it is Community Edition and then performs the rest of the install. The big difference is between the two, though, right? So the code base is the same, but there's some limitations built into Community Edition, right? We don't want users to use Community Edition for production workloads because it's really not a production workload ready environment, right? I can't do the same level of hardware monitoring. I can't do a lot of the physical hardware systems management that I could do in release. Like a failing CVM drive is much more difficult to deal with in Community Edition than, say, it is in release, where you can just pull out a drive and put another one in and everything does the rebuild. Because again, I can't control the hardware. So we limit users to a maximum of 4 nodes. So 1, 3, or 4 node configurations are supported with Community Edition, right? We don't support 2 node because you would need another place to put a witness. So whereas in release we support a 2 node, in Community Edition we don't, because we assume you don't have a place to put it. We do require that you have internet access, right? There's always a give and get, right? So internet access, we have Pulse running on the cluster. Pulse is our dial home system. So you have to have an active connection to the internet in order to authenticate against the .next forums, and for Pulse to create that connection in order for the cluster to run. And we also do not allow you to enable alerts to come off of the cluster via SMTP. So you can't configure email alerting off of the cluster. There's a few other limitations that really tie to like export restrictions and things that would normally require licensing. Like you can't run data at rest encryption in Community Edition. There's no way to apply a license to do it. And using some of the more advanced features, you're still time limited to, say, like 90 days for flow microsegmentation and things like that if you were to deploy them. But otherwise, everything else is the same. So I often have people say, oh, I want to try files. Okay, we can deploy files on Community Edition. How? Just go through the same process you would on release. It will work, trust me. And they can go down that road.
What about features such as like data locality and ADS?
So all that stuff is still there. It's, again, we haven't made any changes or around things like data locality and ADS. Now, one thing I always caution people, remember about the type of drives that you're using in your environment, right? Enterprise drives versus commercial drives versus resiliency. If you're building a single node Nutanix cluster, oftentimes it's going to be RF1, right? If you lose a disk, you're going to lose data, right? Multi-node clusters, though, we still do RF2 to replicate that data across multiple nodes, protect our metadata, and make sure that you have an environment that can stay up and run.
What's next for Nutanix CE?
So we put a lot of focus on the installer for this particular release. We've got some engineering tickets and things that we're working on in engineering around fixing some of those other bugs that are kind of edge cases. You know, a lot of the work around CE is really going to be driven by what is that real target user, right? Initially, our push was the influencers and bloggers and things like that, but the Homelab revolution that's been occurring over the past couple of years, and the fact that the hardware that's available now in such a small form factor is really becoming a reality for a lot of people. So there's a lot of work. I received a question just the other day of, hey, if we were to expand the drivers that would be available in CE, what other drivers would you like to see? Is it additional network drivers? Is it different storage controller drivers? And where do those fit into things like the next AHV releases? And there's some convenience functions that we'd like to add. Some ideas that we've kicked around making the installation a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier, especially if you're doing multi-node installs, right? Because like I said earlier, Foundation, I can deploy a 25-node cluster all at once. Community Edition, I still have to do, I have a KVM and I just get a bunch of USB drives and install for USB drives, but typically people are doing them one at a time. So there's some feature functionality that we're looking at around that. A lot of it also is just to make sure that Community Edition is going to continue to function with the current released versions of, AHV and AOS, right? So right now we're based on AOS 6.8, right? We have a 6.10 release that's that's coming soon. Maybe by the time this is released, 6.10 will be out, right? The expectation is existing users will be able to upgrade to 6.10 within their cluster they've already got. But we also would like to be able to have that as the new deployment when people go and do their install. So, and
that you're talking about as well, having that.
Exactly, exactly. And it's not always perfect. With the LCM process, for example, if a user is booting off of the hypervisor off of USB today, there are definitely challenges in doing AHV updates from, say, the EL7 based AHV to EL8 or EL9, right? That requires a reimage of AHV. That functionality does not work 100% if you're booting off of USB. So although we can boot off USB, we tell people you may want to use an SSD, a small SSD drive for that. You only need 128 gig, right? It doesn't have to be big, but it might be worthwhile to consider that for, your installation. It's a cat and mouse game though, right? It's a cat and mouse game in the Homelab community. As much as there are users that are running old Dell R720 and R730s or HP Gen 8, Gen 9s, things that they pulled out of the dumpster behind a data center somewhere. There's also people that want to run the latest and greatest, newest NUC that just, that they just ordered and showed up, right? I tell people the closer your hardware is to what we officially support and release, the better off you are, right? Like something like a mini S forum, I think it's the MSO1, has been very popular lately because it's got an Intel X710 10 gig adapter built into it, and it's a little NUC-sized device. So it's a good home lab environment for running HVM. It also supports 3 drives, which is nice. So, but that's why we also test on this whole range of hardware to see what people are going to want to try to do.
And so, as far as for Kurt, what's next for Kurt?
Oh man, for me, I'm still trying to figure out what I actually want to be when I grow up. So, no, I mean, I'm continuing to work with the CE teams. I'm continuing to work with the folks both internally and externally. There's a lot of very passionate people inside Nutanix about CE and about the future of CE and where we're going to take it and where it's going to go over the next few years. And there's just as many people outside of Nutanix that are passionate about it, right? For folks that want to get that experience, they want to start, they want to start learning about AHV as a hypervisor. They want to start learning about AOS and the rest of the platform, whether it's NKP for Kubernetes, or if they want to deploy, NDB for database workloads, right? All those things are compatible. All those things will work on Community Edition. So I really, really think it's a great opportunity for folks to get more of an education of how to use and how to run our platform. So I'm continuing to drive that. I love to educate. I love to run boot camps. I love to do, Zoom sessions and things like that to help users out. So I'm going to continue to work and grow with CE as I do my regular day job, right? And try to make my way up the chain further in Nutanix, and keep helping out customers, right? It's always fun when I was out visiting a customer in Cleveland yesterday, and they were talking about how they just want to be able to get their hands on it. They just want to be able to touch it and feel it. And Nutanix is a lot of different ways to give customers experience, right? Whether it's through test drives, whether it's through access to our hosted POC lab, working with folks like you who can, give access to gear that you may own as an organization, right? Like there's a lot of different ways to get access, but sometimes they just want to play around with something for a couple weeks, right? And CE is a really great place for them to get started there. So that's really what's next for me, is just continuing to work and drive CE as best as I can, be a good steward of the technology within the forums in the community, and hopefully help people learn more and kind of build their careers. And we've all spent a lot of time knowing and learning ESX and the VMware stack. And I mean, I built a portion of my career with VMware, right? It's time for folks to maybe start to pivot and start to learn another technology, and we want to be able to provide people with the methodology to do that.
Awesome. So for the folks out there who are looking to dive into ACI, are you still running EXXi on your host, on your home lab, or Hyper-V? It's time to make the switch, as you have the guy here, Kurt, has the emotion of it oozing out of him. So, Kurt, I thank you for joining us today. I'm really happy that you're able to come and talk to us about Nutanix CE.
Yeah, great. I've absolutely enjoyed myself. It's fantastic. We'll talk again soon.
Yeah, we will. Thank you, and thank everyone for joining.